collector spotlight is on Adam Fortier. Adam has been collecting his entire life, has gone through many different eras of comics, has some really interesting stories to tell, and has a really exciting new project because he currently works in comics. So before we hop into it, I want to remind you we have the giveaway here on the YouTube channel. Subscribe, comment, and like. You're entered to win a free slab. Head over to BryceComics.com, sign up for the newsletter, get entered to win a free slab each and every month. Constantly have new inventory coming through over there. Use code COLLECT10 for 10% off. And Bryce Comics is always buying. So if you're interested in selling your collection, shoot me an email at brycecomics@gmail.com. We'll get you a fast, fair offer, get you paid quick. I do really well on high-end books. I rival, auction houses and stuff like that. If you're thinking about sending your super high-value books to auction, you might want to shoot me an email first and just see what I can offer. And that contact info is down below. Without further ado, let's talk to Adam Fortier. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I think I'll just start by saying how we were connected was actually through Ross Ritchie, the former CEO of Boom Studios, who connected us and thought that you'd be, a great guest to have on for this little collector spotlight special. So thank you for coming on, and I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and share with us some of your awesome stories.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on here. I really appreciate it. I've been friends with Ross for going on 2 decades now, and talk about not learning your lesson. I'm still friends with him after 2 decades. In relation to my history, so it came by comics naturally. I've always been a huge comic book nut. My grandfather would buy me Archie comics and Disney comics, and eventually superhero comics as I got like 8, 9, 10 years old. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was actually working in a comic book store in the 90s. And that was that was an interesting experience. I got to sell The Death of Superman. I got to sell, I think I sold like 8 platinum copies of Spider-Man #1. So it was really in the time when collecting was obviously popular, but it was also seen as like this gigantic spike in interest and this gigantic spike in, the ability to be able to sell product. And so being on the, being on the front lines for that was really cool. And then not so cool after the whole collapse happened. And so I went to school for math and physics and became a computer programmer. I worked for companies like Xerox and Bank of Montreal, which is a Canadian bank. And just one day woke up probably around 2000 and said, man, comics are still really fun. I wish that I could make them. And so I was able to connect with a company called Dreamwave Studios in Toronto, Canada. And the first comic book that I ever made from publishing was actually Transformers #1 for Dreamwave. And so I've been making comic books for the last 2 decades about. And the only reason I give that entire story is to understand kind of where my love of comics came from and how, I was very fortunate in that I was able to have a love affair with comics, a real comic collection, and then go into making comics,
Right.
So my experience was a little bit unique. I was able to own, Amazing Fantasy 15s, Detective Comics 27, Marvel Comics #1, all of that stuff from back in the day.
Wow.
When I say the year 2000, it's important to remember that was Y2K, and so when you were a computer programmer, you were making good money.
Gotcha. Yeah, connecting to some of the dots here. So, one little tidbit that we kind of glossed over that I want to make sure we unpack a little bit. I'm always trying to think. There's people watching this that are kind of like, what is he talking about here? Maybe that don't have the full backstory. So when you talk about working in the comic store in the 90s, that's when we saw this huge bubble and burst of what would you call it? Speculation comic books like Death of Superman
Yeah.
and Spider-Man #1, and when you
I think
go ahead.
speculation comics is a very good way of putting it, but I would also say this is when like Jim Lee relaunched X-Men with X-Men
Right.
#1, Todd McFarlane relaunched Spider-Man with Spider-Man #1. So not only was there speculation, there was also a lot of really good comics getting made. like
Right.
in
And
a yeah.
it goes not to mention that those particular books, X-Men 1 and Spider-Man 1 are 50 to $100 even though there's millions of them. So
Yes.
it's not
Mhm.
necessarily like it was a bad spec, but when you say you sold 8 Spider-Man Platinums,
Oh yes.
are you hinting at the fact that the store had to order 100 in order to get one platinum? Is that how it worked?
No, so the way it worked back then was every single store got one Platinum Spider-Man number one. I worked for a chain of stores, and we were so successful in selling our Platinum Spider-Man number one. I think we sold it for, I want to say, between $1,000 and $3,000. That they would send us another one, and we sold it, and then they sent us another one, and so we were grabbing other stores' copies of Spider-Man number one Platinum because we were just able to sell them for as much money as we could. This was just before the internet like really took off, so this wasn't really a time of eBay or anything. You had to go into comic book stores or go to conventions if you really wanted a chance to get good comics.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so that was the foundation. Then you go to school, then you start making comic books, and you were producing comic books for 20 years, you said now you've been doing it?
Yeah, so I started out with a company called Dreamwave Productions. We made
Uh-huh.
Transformers comics. We made Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics. We made Legend of Zelda comics, Devil May Cry. We did a Drew Struzan art book, things like that. And so I did that for about 3 years. We are still the only independent company ever to have a number one comic book in the entire industry. We with Transformers, the very first comic I made, we outsold every single Marvel and DC comic. And it actually happened over a 6 month period. So for 6 months, we were the number one and the number two comic book because we had two Transformers series. So it was a bit of a trial by fire, but it definitely helped supercharge my career. After Dreamwave, I did some work for IDW. IDW got GI Joe and Transformers. I was part of that. Then we got a lot of other licensing things. But after IDW, I did my own company called Speakeasy, and then I worked for Boom Studios for probably about 10 years. And my main job there was again licensing. I did Games Workshop, I did Yoshitaka Amano, Dune, Disney, of course, Farscape, all of that stuff. And that's probably the longest job I've had in comics. And then just really acting as a consultant for other companies. So a company would call me up and say, I want to make a video game book. I did Divinity Original Sin 2, if you're into video games at all. And so the video game company just called me up and said, I want to make a graphic novel. And I'm like, sure. And so that just became my job. So it's morphed a little bit.
Let's talk a little bit about your personal collection of comic books, and then we can transition to that exciting
Mm-hmm.
project that you have going right now, because I know you have a really
Absolutely.
exciting
Yep.
thing in the works. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned a Tech 27 and a AF-15. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I do not own them anymore. It was a bit of a surreal experience to see the Detective 27 that I owned probably about again about like 15 years ago, sold for auction. When I bought and sold it, it was much lower, but it ended up being about a 5.5 unrestored. Um, and it actually really helped my latest project because I almost want to say it's like it's a virtually unique experience. Like we all know the stories. We've seen in many cases the artwork. If I talk to somebody about Amazing Fantasy 15 and they're a comic book fan, if they've never seen one in person, they can probably visualize what the cover looks like. They can probably visualize even what the 6 page story looks like. Um, but there's something different about like holding the book in your hands. There's something different about feeling the texture of the paper, about smelling, the age. And to me, what I love about it is it connects us to like really important moments in the past. I mean, the creation of Spider-Man is like one of the most significant moments in the last 100 years, I would
Right.
say. you know.
I
And
agree.
so
I
like
agree.
it's Spider-Man, man. It's
Yeah.
the first time anybody had a chance to see Spider-Man. Same thing with Detective Comics 27. It was the first chance anybody got to see Batman,
Right.
you know. And so owning that book, being able to flip through that book was really cool. But I also had the flip side where, and it was in particular for that book, and I'll say this, it was like the book sat in my basement, and I would sit in my bed and I'd wake up and I'd be like, is the book degrading in my basement? Like
Right.
like there's no, I
I,
wasn't able to look at the book and be like, oh, like, you know, this quarter is tearing or anything like that. But you just start to get overwhelmed by the sense of like every day that I own this book, it's getting in worse and worse shape,
it's
you know?
really interesting that you would say that because I just interviewed Jeff Williams. I don't know if you know Jeff Williams. He mentioned the
Not personally, no.
dealer. What's that?
I don't know him personally, no.
Oh, okay. He mentioned the dealer Harley, which Ross also mentioned, which I think
Yes,
you have connections to.
I'm very good friends with Harley. He sold me my first rare comic book.
Okay, so there might be a you guys may have like crossed paths at one point, but anyway, see,
I'm
we
sure.
talked a little bit about page quality and he and degradation of books and things like that. So when you bought the AF-15 and the Detective Comics 27, they were both raw. Was it before CGC
Yes.
even?
It was around when CGC was just coming out. So I can tell you the Detective 27 was 5.5 unrestored. That was not CGC'd. The AF-15 was actually the Mohawk Valley copy. And at the same time, I owned a showcase for Mohawk Valley as well. And that's the first Silver Age Flash, which I'm sure you know, but maybe not every single one of your guests knows.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
So
always good to say.
so probably like 16 years ago, Amazing Fantasy 15 and Showcase number 4 were considered the two most important Silver Age books. Now
Right.
Showcase number 4 is probably like the 15th most important Silver Age book.
Well, I mean, it's funny that you would say that. I mean, I think it's unanimously agreed as the first Silver Age book. When you
Mm-hmm.
get, it's not even worth really talking about. They're incredibly important books, all of them, so
Well, yeah,
you don't
yeah.
really need
It,
to
it
know
was
which one's the most.
it was just again a weird experience historically having like I probably spent more money on the Showcase number 4 Mohawk Valley
Right,
15 years ago than I spent on the Amazing Fantasy 15 years ago.
right, right,
Whereas today, the same books would probably cost me about 20% of what I'd have to pay for the Amazing Fantasy 15
right.
for the Showcase 4 today. So
Yeah,
it's just a
yeah.
weird disparity.
I know. I think I probably over the last couple decades, the pop culture success of the franchise is probably what accounts for
Mm-hmm.
that. Like when it was
Oh,
just,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
100% agreed. And I mean, I'd make the same argument for like Incredible Hulk 181 and Amazing Fantasy or Amazing Spider-Man 129. Like when I worked in comic book stores, it was easier to sell the first appearance of the Punisher in the 1990s than it was to sell the first appearance of Wolverine. Wolverine was hugely popular,
right,
but the Punisher was incredibly popular.
right,
And so those books were neck and neck. Whereas right now, while Amazing Spider-Man 129 is worth money, Incredible Hulk 181 is just the gold standard for Bronze Age books. I mean, it
right,
just keeps on going up, and it's never a
right.
bad idea to buy a first appearance of Wolverine.
Right. So Detective Comics 27, you purchased the book because you loved the book, because you were finally in a
Yes,
position financially to do it, and there it was,
yes.
and you bought it.
Yeah, I owned an All American Comics 16. I owned All Star Comics number 3, number 8, Marvel Comics number 1. I was again just in a very fortunate place in my life, and these were all like like if you're a comic fan growing up, like to me in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, these were the books that defined. They started it all.
Right.
Like that's it.
And so what was the impetus to sell? And did you get it graded before you sold?
I didn't get it graded before I sold, and I actually sold it through Harley Yee. And the impetus was just that I had all these really cool books, but I was becoming like very stressed about condition and
The
about
condition.
degradation and all of that stuff. Yeah. And so I was like, it wasn't fun back then to own these books.
Right.
Um, and I would argue a little bit of it is CGC, I think, gives you a little bit more of a sense of calmness around it now. When something's graded and something's in a container and then that's in a box and then that's in like, a secure room, it feels a little bit different for sure
Right.
now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mentioned this in the last one. I don't know why CGC doesn't offer a museum quality case for, I mean,
Hmm.
like that you put the Declaration of Independence in. We were talking about Tech 27. I mean, you don't want to
Yes,
worry about the paper quality. We have it in a 50-cent piece of plastic. So,
exactly.
yeah, it's an interesting concept. Worrying about the degradation of these incredible. I think most people would only dream to have that luxury problem, so,
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
and that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a luxury problem. So anyways, yeah, it sounds like you've had some of the best. What strikes your fancy now? What gets you excited now with comics?
Um, so right now we're doing this project through Kickstarter called Pre-Code Horror, and they're essentially facsimile copies of old pre-code horror books. And when we say pre-code horror, we mean before the Comics Code Authority, and so that's usually books in the 1940s and 1950s. And I'm having a lot of fun with those because when you read old Marvel and DC books, like nowadays you're reading the reprints, and in many cases they've like recolored them, drew them, and in some cases rewrote them. So
Let's
you're kind
share
of
let's I think I know
oh
where you're
yeah,
going with this. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's pull up the
oh
Kickstarter.
sure,
So here it is, right?
hmm,
This is the project, which by the way is just flying. Last time I checked it was
yeah,
like 270. But to the point that you're talking about, and we'll go through all this here in just a sec, are you talking about the way that you reprinted them is true to the way they were printed back
Yeah,
in?
I will definitely get to that. But what I was also going to say is most of these books have never been censored in any way. Whereas, when you read the early Batmans, you understand that Batman has a gun and that's weird, but we don't really get to see those stories now. So doing this project really allowed me to see some kind of like crazy out there stories from the 1940s and 1950s that you just normally would never get to see. That is, but in relation to creating the content, I can tell you, like you're exactly right. Which is my history of owning these books allowed me kind of like a unique glimpse into what it felt like to have the original books, and definitely Amazing Fantasy 50 and Detective 27 really solidified that for me. Where I realized in the facsimiles that they create today and the reprints that they create today, they're not on the same paper, they're not printed in the same way. Back then, they used dots for everything up until about the 1970s in order to print books. And so we've kind of like recreated the books. And the argument that I always give is it would be the equivalent of somebody redoing the Mona Lisa and then saying it's about as good as the original. And it's not. Like the original's better. Going to see the Mona Lisa is better than having a poster of the Mona Lisa in your house. Flat out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I kind of went on a multi-year journey to figure out like, can we make books the same way that they made books in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s? Like, you know, there's something to being able to experience the first appearance of Batman in the way that they experienced the first appearance of Batman in 1939 when he first appeared, you know?
Right.
And so it's just the experience is different. And so I'll show you this. So this is a sample page that we just printed for the pre-code horror, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually like on the exact same paper, and this is actually our copy. But you can see that it looks very much like an old style book because it's on the same paper, it's using the same printing style and the whole thing. And so when I figured out that I was able to do that, that's really when this pre-code horror Kickstarter came up. We wanted to have some fun with it, and there's a number of these books that are just going crazy nowadays in the market. That again, just nobody will ever own. Some of them are like, I think Suspense Comics #3, which I can pull out, is the most expensive non-Marvel, non-DC book um, in the marketplace, and I think 37 copies exist or something like that,
Right.
like according to CGC. So it's crazy. Nobody's ever going to own them, and to me, it was like really cool to be able to. It would be really cool to be able to bring them to life, and so when we were able to do that, that's when we decided to do the Kickstarter.
All right. So walk us through the Kickstarter here because we I think we have like 12 minutes left or so, and I want to make sure
Oh,
we
sorry.
cover everything here. So walk us through like, what do we need to know about this? And I want to, and also would love to see the originals that we're talking about
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. Here, I can totally pull some of these things out here. Um, so the Kickstarter, the impetus was, being able to share some really cool books with people, but also it was really important for us to be able to actually get the same quality. So when we were able to determine that we could get the same quality, that's really when we decided to do the Kickstarter. Now, the Kickstarter, the important thing about it was we started from the perspective of, what are some really cool books that people would like to own? But then we also said, that's essentially what everybody does. Everybody does. Oh, you want to own Amazing Fantasy 15. You want to own Amazing Spider-Man #1. But as a avid collector, I know Amazing Spider-Man #2 is great. Amazing Spider-Man #3 is great. And so we also offered the entire runs. So not only can you get, and let me pull out like one of the really cool ones here. This is without a doubt one of my favorite ones. Not only can you get like a Chamber of Chills 19.
Hold on one sec.
um,
There we go.
yeah.
Let's make the screen bigger.
So not only can you get a Chamber of Chills 19, but you get it in the condition that it would have been when it was released into the books, the comic book stores. And you get and there's no guilt to it. There's another aspect of owning CGC books where cracking them open feels bad. And so, we also wanted to recognize that, hey, maybe you do own these books, and maybe you'd actually want to enjoy them and read them. And here's our Suspense Comics #3 that you have up on your screen. But again, oh sorry, yeah, let me take this out. But yeah, it was really about like, not only do I want to give you the original books, but I also want to give you all the other books, because there's lots of like really cool books. Suspense Comics #4 is neat. And then from a historical perspective, all of these books are very important because these books helped lead to the book banning and book burning. You can see a picture of them burning the comic books because a
So
gentleman named
one
Frederick
thing
Wortham.
this is a striking image, and this is
Yep.
for those that don't know, like the pre-code. Uh, I mean, just explain to us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so a gentleman named Frederick Wortham wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And it was a novel that essentially postulated that comic books were destroying the youths of America. They were like telling terrible stories. They were, causing kids to become evil or bad. And it got to the point where it reached the Senate, and the comic book companies recognized that they were either going to get shut down, heavily regulated, or they could regulate themselves. And so they created something called the CCA, which is the Comics Code Authority. And the
Right,
Comics Code Authority had to essentially approve the contents of a comic book before it was able to be published.
right. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why books like this and all of the books that you're reprinting through this
Mm-hmm.
Kickstarter are so scarce is because they were burned. What's striking to me about this image is the children all
Mm-hmm.
look so happy. That
Yes. I mean, in many respects, like back in the 1950s, which is when this happened, comic books were disposable. So the idea that you're like, hey, let's go burn a bunch of comics, um, it's a weird thing, but people weren't keeping rooms of comics, to be able to read them later. And so I don't know that you would have the same visceral reaction that you would have had today,
Right.
you know.
So yeah. So that was just what was the most surprising thing about this was like that. It seems like they drank the Kool-Aid. Like the kids are in on it.
Yes,
Like these are bad.
yes,
This is fun. We get to destroy these terrible things now, and
exactly.
everyone was in on it and agreed
Hmm.
with this Frederick Wortham. Which, by the way, you guys can go buy a copy of the book. They have a
Yep.
million different reprints on Amazon and stuff.
Hmm.
And actually, the original is highly collectible. I have a
Yes.
copy of the first print, I believe,
Hmm.
of Seduction of the Innocent, and
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you can go get a reprint for relatively inexpensive. Expect this Kickstarter to do as well as it is doing.
No, no, it's definitely it has performed better than we wanted it to. Our goal has always been to have the Kickstarter, and then we're also having stuff that are going out to the comic book stores, like trade paperbacks and things like that. The Kickstarter was for specifically the comic books. And so we came up with, I think, a novel approach where when you buy this, you're actually going to get a box set. And the box is very nicely designed. You can see the boxes there. And so even though you're buying individual comics, it becomes something very easy that you can just put on your shelf, um, which is a problem with comic books.
Talk to me a little bit about you're the perfect person to ask about this because you have a rich history in comics, you have a love for the originals, you sold stuff during the boom. Now you're doing this Kickstarter with all these backers, and you have foil variants. And by the way, talking to a retailer here who loves his foil variants, who has store exclusives in foil. Talk to
Yep.
me about the crossover of putting a foil cover on these pre-code horror books.
Well, and I will also tell you the fluorescents are actually the ones that really blow your mind on a next
There
level.
we
Just because I've seen the test prints of them, and I'm like, oh my god, they're so cool. Honestly, it was really just we wanted to be responsive to the present market. The present market is very pro foils and things like that. Look, when I did Transformers back in the day, they didn't do variant covers because in the 90s they said, well, variants and foils and all of that stuff destroyed the market. And so if you go back to the Transformers days, nobody was doing more than one cover. And when I got in, I was like, well, you need to do an Autobots and a Decepticons cover. Like, it just makes sense. You have, are you an Autobot or are you Decepticon? It makes sense. But it was also, we've got to do a foil because they're all made out of metal. So, like 20 years ago, I was still into this stuff. But honestly, this stuff is more for the retailers and everything like that. They're fun and they look cool. To me, the
and
insides are the main component. Yeah.
and you touched on it, and Stanley himself is the one who I think pioneered the idea that you got to give people what they want. And if the collectors
Exactly.
want foil covers, so for all the people out there that, have a problem with it, look, they're cool covers, they look cool, and it's what the current market is demanding.
Hmm.
So we've got this is the everything box is
Is the
so
crazy box. Yes.
right. So it's got the entire run of Suspense, Punch,
Yeah. The
and Chamber Chills and
suspense,
Weird.
chumps, chamber chills, weird mysteries, and weird chills. Yes.
Okay, so you get the entire run printed on the same type of paper that they were originally printed on with the dot and
Yes.
line printing
Yes.
style.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then so if somebody wanted just that, they can order just if they're not into the foil, they're not into
Yes.
the fluorescent, they just want the
Yes. The tier just above is the give me everything, but not everything, everything. And that's essentially just buying a run of everything.
gotcha.
This gives you
And
all the runs plus all the foils plus the fluorescence.
right. So how this might just be more interesting to me as a retailer. How did you get the rights like to reprint the source material? Was that
Hmm.
a obstacle? Like what was that an interesting
No, in relation to this one in particular, these are public domain. And
Okay.
so they don't have copyrights against them. In relation to our next project, which I'm not always supposed to talk about, but the pre-launch page is going live on Monday, so it's actually Archie Comics. And so our next Kickstarter, which is happening in the month of December, is Authentic Editions Archie Comics. And so for those, we did obtain the rights, and so we're actually working with Archie to make the books. And so
Gotcha.
they will still
Gotcha.
be released by us, but we had to license them. So some books are public domain. You don't need to license. Some books you do have to license.
So we have about 3.5 minutes left, just FYI.
Of course.
What um concerns are there, if any, of how of people passing these off as originals? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
how close is the the printing? I mean, it's always an issue when a facsimile comes out. Like
Yeah.
Ultimate Fallout
Mm-hmm.
4, they did a facsimile that was so close, and there was scams left and right of people taking advantage of people selling them as the originals.
Yeah.
Is it not that close? Is there any
Uh,
concern at
it,
all?
it actually is that close. Because what we've done is we're also maintaining the same trim size, we're maintaining the same cover price. So the ones that you buy on the Kickstarter will actually have a 10-cent cover price. But the copyright notice has changed. There's a QR code on the back cover, and so
Okay.
it's pretty obvious.
Okay.
But to be to be to be super blunt about it, if somebody wants to try and pull it off as the original, they're going to do it. It's going to happen on
Right.
eBay. I'm
Right.
sure it is, but it's relatively easy to tell the difference.
Okay. So there are it's not a complete copy. There's markings and QR codes and things like
No,
that.
it's legally we're not able to. Like for instance, we have to specify where it was printed. Originally, these were printed in the United States. We're printing them right now in Canada, so it has to be printed in Canada. So that's a pretty obvious one. The QR code thing is we're also doing digital twins. And so we want people to be able to take their physical books and to pair them with their digital copy. So you can actually get the, Suspense Comics #3 that you buy. You can get the digital version in a digital reader app that is owned by yourself at no additional cost,
Hmm.
just for
So
fun.
with a minute and a half left to go, having been in this hobby your entire life, having
Mm-hmm.
gone through so many, fits and starts and changing directions and where you're at now, what advice would you have for new collectors coming into the hobby or old collectors alike? Like what is your parting words of wisdom?
I think if you've been collecting comics for a while, you have figured this out, but collect what you love. It's as simple as that. The moment that you start playing comic books like the stock market, it can become fairly destructive, and that's what we saw in the 1990s. Like the speculators who I had a gentleman whose son convinced him to come in. He was a doctor, and he bought 500 copies of every single cover to X-Men #1. There were 5 covers to the Jim Lee X-Men #1. He bought 500 copies of each, and I happily sold them to him. But even back then, it would mean that he would spend about $3,000, and it was done just as an investment. Whereas if you loved X-Men and you loved Jim Lee, I could see 20 years from now, remembering that you had 500 copies left over, you'd be jazzed. You'd be like, "This is great! I'm going to get these CGC'd. I'm going to love it." But if you bought them hoping to flip them in a couple of years for a lot of money, it wasn't a pleasant experience. And so,
Yeah.
if you buy what you love, it doesn't really matter if you sell it.
So I hope you guys enjoyed talking to Adam. Let me know what you think about this Kickstarter project down in the comments below. Thanks as always for sticking with me to the end of the video. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye.